some leeway and some flexibility, but flexibility only take you so far. And first of all, I'd like to, on behalf of the IFO Institute, EconPol, and the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, to welcome you to today's session. It's the session regarding the launch of our paper, the Climate Policy Priorities for the next European Commission. We were supposed to have 240 people registered in a room and about 500 online, so we'll see exactly what the lines are. We think that about 66% that usually show up, so we'll see what exactly the numbers are by the end of the day. The good thing is that at the end there's also a cocktail reception, so maybe people will come only at the end for the cocktail reception. Now, I want to what I wanted to first of all give the floor to Clemens Fuest, who is the president of IFO, to also welcome you on behalf of IFO.
Thank you, Andre. Yes, welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. This was a very interesting project for us, a new style of project, and Andre will say more about how we did this. I think it's obvious that we are talking about a very important policy issue. Also, I think a policy issue which will be discussed differently in the next 5 years if we compare it to the last, because the world around us has changed. So I think there are some very important economic and policy issues coming up, and we'll try to discuss those. Thank you.
Very well. The one thing that I will just tell everybody, every room has its own quirks. This room has the quirk that you really have to speak in the microphone because there's presumably 500 people. I don't think there are 500. I don't believe that, but 200-300 there'll still be. So I'll ask the speakers to speak very close to the microphone, or else they will not hear it. Now, if I can, Antoine, can I please have the slides on so we can start? And if somebody on the Zoom doesn't see the slides, then I think that we'll hear from them very quickly. So we have a presentation. I don't think this is the way it's supposed to be. Very well. So we got the presentation. I hope that everybody on Zoom has the presentation. The presentation is a bit of ballet between Clemens, Michael Melling, who is the other co-author of this report, and myself. So we will try and do a bit of ballet and change as the slides go ahead. So let's go to the first slide, Antoine. Okay, so what was the objective? Why do we do this? I don't think I'm telling you, anybody in Brussels, the great secret that there is the elections coming up in Brussels. There will be a new architecture, a new component of the European institutions, whether the Commission or whether it is the European Parliament. So there also a lot of election also happening through the rest of the world this year. So it's an important election year. But the national sport in Brussels at this time, this year, and I think Yvonne and her colleagues have been at the receiving end of a lot of this stuff, is everybody has a piece of advice. And everybody thinks that his piece of advice, his or her piece of advice is better than the other piece of advice. We think ours is better. So what we did is frankly, Michael and I talked about this for a while and decided that this was a good idea. And then we got on a plane, very simply, we got on a plane and went to Munich to convince Clemens Fuest that it was an interesting idea, and we were elated that he thought it was a good idea. So he decided that he would join, and we're very pleased that this is a cooperation between ourselves and IFO. IFO, of course, is a much bigger institute than ERCST is, so we're very happy to be all together. But the objective of the project was really to identify and scrutinize various issues that should be considered by the EU institution in the next policy cycle. So we went through this kind of back and forth a little bit as to, is this recommendations or this identification of issues that need to really be considered and analyzed? So because the original idea very much was, listen, there are a number of areas, European institutions, when you reconvene, there are a number of things that we think you should examine. And that was the idea. As we went along, I think we introduced a number of suggestions and recommendations, but we think the spirit of the kind of identifying issues and why they are issues, why they merit to be examined by the European institution as they reconvene in the next political cycle, I think that spirit still exists there. Next, please. So in order to be informed and get advice, because we think we're pretty smart, but and the institutions have a lot of depth, because you see three people here, but there are a lot of other colleagues of ours that have been working behind the scenes on this. We invited an advisory board of people that we felt we would like to hear the advice of. And I'm not going to go through the list. Some of them are at this table. Or obviously Yvonne Schlingenberg and Gabriel Gauthier and Charles Weimüller and Michael Melling. So all these people have been, but there are others. We try to be as balanced as possible. I mean, that, the idea was, can we get people that will have different ideas and will bring different issues? Can we bring them together? And we think that it was a balance, a very interesting process, I can tell you, with a lot of interesting ideas and back and forth between the members of the group and ourselves. Again, we want to emphasize that the report that you have is not a report of the group. It's a report of IFO and ERCSD, and the advisory group provide the advice to the authors of the group of the report, but they are not in any way responsible, and the views do not represent the views of the advisory group. Next, please. Now, the way we didn't want to, kind of have a room, we talked to a bunch of people and we write a report. So we didn't look for a complicated process, but we wanted the process that really brought us closer to the stakeholders. So what we did is, first of all, we had meetings with the advisory group in plenum. We interviewed the individual advisory group members as the time went by. So that was a fairly time-consuming process, because we had a couple of hours interview with each of the members of the advisory group. And then we went to three capitals, and the capitals were our choice. We would have liked to do more, but the resources and the time involved limit us to Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw. That happened in the fall 2023. So this paper is informed by the meeting with the stakeholders in Berlin, Warsaw, and Paris, and the discussion with the advisory group in plenum and in individual interviews. Next, please. Now I will pass it at this point to Clemens. So Clemens, the paper has two parts. One of them is overarching issues or issues of principle. I don't know whatever way you want to call it, but there's also then there are a number of discrete issues that Michael and I will present. So Clemens, please go ahead.
Thank you. Should I take that mic? Okay, yes. So the first overarching issue is, as it were, the macroeconomics of climate change. I think if you look at the large and complex debate about these issues, there are maybe two stories out there. One story is decarbonization is something that is not very costly in economic terms. Some people even say it's going to create a big boom because there will be so much new investment, or Europe will develop new technologies and things like that. And then there is the other story out there saying there is a big economic cost. Europe will become uncompetitive. There will be carbon leakage. Companies will leave the EU and so on. The point we make in this paper, and that reflects the discussion we've had, is that more attention needs to be paid not so much to the GDP effects of carbon change. For instance, some studies, including the recent assessment of the European Commission, very much emphasize the GDP effect, and in that case downplay the cost. Why does a focus on GDP downplay the cost? The trouble is not that the GDP declines. The trouble is that consumption declines. If what happens, decarbonization is to a large extent a process where you have an existing capital stock and that capital stock gets stranded. So you have to write off assets that work perfectly well. Now, it's a bit like tearing down your house and building it up again in a climate neutral fashion. That's nice, but it's very costly in terms of consumption. And if you look at the impact on consumption, and a number, we cite a study about Germany here, but there are other studies by the OECD, or this is a point also made in recent work by Jean Pisani. The real economic challenge is the consumption sacrifice during the transition. Once we have made it to a decarbonized economy, these things are done. And the decarbonized economy, we don't know how it will work, but there is a potential that it will work quite effectively. But the huge challenge is the decarbonization. So Jean Pisani, for instance, in his work, thinks that in the next 10 years, there will be, or within 10 years, there will be a sacrifice in consumption of 3%. This is massive compared to the counterfactual. The question is always, how do you define the counterfactual? And compared to a counterfactual with slower decarbonization, the sacrifice of consumption is 3%. So in 3%, the path of consumption is, in 10 years, the path of consumption is 3% lower. And this gets worse if you accelerate the transition. Now, if you don't question that you want to be decarbonized in 2050, the question is, of course, how do you distribute the investments over time so that you get there? But I think it's obvious, because you have no time to write off assets, the more front-loaded this gets, the bigger is this consumption sacrifice. And what does that mean? First of all, there is, and I think we should be frank about that, there is a very high cost in the transition of accelerating decarbonization. There's a reward later, but we have to get through that. How can we react to that? I think this just emphasizes various things. First of all, we have to do this efficiently and have to put a lot more emphasis on cost minimization. We also need to take into account that there are other challenges that have come up. For instance, defense. Defense is very much the same story. So we need to spend more resources on defense. Where do they come from? Okay, what's going to decline? Probably consumption. If we don't want to reduce investments, it's going to have to be consumption. So we need to think about how we can address both challenges at a time. And maybe we need complementary policies focusing on generating more economic growth or a more efficient use of resources. Within climate policy, we need to make sure we use efficient instruments, we minimize the cost, we take into account, that's the next slide, please. We need to take into account the impact on industries and competitiveness. And we emphasize in the report that climate policy has to be seen in the context, for instance, of industrial policy. Now, what does that mean? And what does it not mean? It doesn't mean that we should use industrial policy to produce goods relevant for decarbonization at home. Some people think we should subsidize production of solar panels or wind turbines or things like that at home. Now, what this says is we should do exactly the opposite. We should make sure that we do not put more strain on our limited production capacity than necessary. So if we can import this stuff from China at low prices, that's absolutely the best we can do. So we need to, taking into account the impact on competitiveness and industrial policy means we just have to make sure that our industry, our production capacities are not overstrained. Okay. That was that discussion. And then, of course, if you want to minimize costs, you need to take, next slide, please, take into account things like technology neutrality and cost effectiveness. Here, the European approach traditionally has been quite good with its focus on the CO2 price, but more recently, an increasing number of people are saying we should add all kinds of other instruments to that, and the CO pricing is not enough. We know that for many reasons, but we need to be careful to align other instruments with CO2 pricing so that in the end we really do get cost minimization. And next slide, please. And that's also related to regulatory instruments. I think we have different climate-related policies in Europe, but they are not always compatible. So we have climate policy, in environmental policy, then we have climate policy in financial policy, we have the EU taxonomy. which is completely incompatible with CO2 pricing. It's not clear, if you combine both, does it lead to efficiency? Does it destroy efficiency? So we've had a lot of debate on that. My personal view is, but that's just my personal view, is we could get rid of the taxonomy tomorrow and the world would be a better place. But that's controversial. So what we are saying here is that increasingly among companies, among citizens, there is a sense of regulatory fatigue, and there is a lot of bureaucratic burden companies struggle with. It's one of the reasons most frequently cited as a reason not to invest in Europe, and that needs to be taken into account. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you, Clemens. So these were things that issues, if you want, of principle overarching issues that should be part of the consideration when there's the new political cycle, the current policies are continued in the sense of uh, different directives that are maybe unfinished or the new ones that are coming to the floor. These are things that need to be considered, but we also have identified a number of issues. So if you want to go to the next slide, Antoine, please. And so we call them climate policy priorities for the next political cycle. And one of the things, the first thing that we identified is that to be sustainable, EU climate policy must achieve success in international cooperation and climate diplomacy. What does that mean? That is, this is something that the EU has done. It's not something that we haven't done, and the EU is not doing. The Commission has been doing the external action, et cetera, et cetera. But we are now, to be quite blunt about it, it is a necessary condition that at some point we start seeing real movement in other countries. Otherwise, this is not going to be sustainable. And we literally must redouble our efforts in international cooperation, international diplomacy, climate diplomacy, because otherwise, in the long term, and I would say in the long term, I would call it the middle 30s probably, EU climate policy may not be sustainable and not ensure European climate economic prosperity. What we need to do is we need to make sure that we have metrics, clear metrics for the transition. There are a number of issues that we need to have in order for the transition to be successful. Renewable energy, electrification, hydrogen, CCS. These are all things that need to be considered. And we need to have clear metrics in order to be able to follow on that. We looked at something that was appealing to us in terms of a catchy word, and we call them highway rules. And what we said is that on the highway, at least where I come from, is you can't drive slower than the rest of the traffic because you're going to be penalized. You're impeding the traffic. Neither you can drive too fast because then you're going to put your passenger at risk. So the question is European speed of movement of decarbonization according to highway rules, or is something that we need to examine? There are gaps that exist between the assumptions that were made at the time when many of the Fit for 55 European Green Deal assumptions were made and current conditions. We looked from our side, we look at a number of these, especially if you want in transportation, and some of the assumptions that were made at that time. I mean, remember, this was started at the time of no energy crisis, the time of relative prosperity, geopolitical stability. A lot of these things have changed. Does it merit to be reviewed, revisited in some way? It's something that at least we think people should be looking at. Michael?
Next slide, please. So one of the themes that we heard in the town halls, in the stakeholder consultations with altogether, I think about 200 people from very different backgrounds, was also that the complexities and simply the rapid increase in regulatory density has augmented something that, of course, has always been part and parcel of climate policy. Climate is a ubiquitous and a cross-cutting challenge, of course, and so it's always been something where we've said we have to mainstream the achievement of climate goals across all policy areas, across all sectors. But it's arguably really only under the European Green Deal with its unprecedented scope in all areas, financial regulation, oversight, agriculture, industrial policy, labor, the just transition, social topics, etc., that we're seeing this really starting to bear out. And with that sort of complexity, growing complexity and the interlinkages, also comes renewed pressure to make sure that we leverage the synergies where they exist, but also avoid inefficiencies. Clemens already alluded to some of them. And we think that these interlinkages and complexities will only become more and more visible as we progress in the implementation of the European Green Deal. So just to give some examples, of course, Clemens already alluded to the fact that when you have more and more instruments tackling or trying to sort of advance climate objectives in different sectors, and also now in the remit, let's say, of other areas of policymaking, such as finance, you mentioned the taxonomy, you really have to be increasingly careful of the alignment across instruments. Even in the past, we've had sometimes inefficient interactions between the EU ETS, say targeted policies on renewables, and now we add additional policies that may sort of weaken or introduce inefficiencies. Of course, there has been awareness of this, but it is trickier to actually get right than it might seem. Also, we'd like to think that all of these efforts will only unleash synergies and work together very well, but there will be trade-offs. It's something that's not often or not easily said. It's not a popular message, but at some points we do have to balance different objectives, and achieving them at the same time may not always be something that's doable synergistically. Just one example of many, Clemens already alluded to the fact that there's pressure given geopolitical tensions, the need for stable, resilient supply chains, et cetera, to onshore or reshore some of these supply chains, to have domestic manufacturing targets for clean technologies, et cetera. But those are not going to be the cheapest. We know that, and nor is it going to happen overnight. So as we sort of try to shift away and move away from relying on low-cost inputs from other countries, we are facing a balancing act there as well. There may be inefficiencies from trying to pursue climate objectives through other policy areas like finance that we already talked about. And again, ensuring consistency overall is really important. Now, another important thing that we heard in this sort of stakeholder engagement was that there's also these interlinkages in the ability to decarbonize across sectors. There will be a conditionality of achieving progress in certain areas, say, for instance, in making green or sustainable hydrogen affordable broadly at scale and also at reasonable cost, before we can then also decarbonize certain industries. Similarly with CCS infrastructure, making that infrastructure available will be important before we can actually start using carbon capture, storage, and carbon dioxide removal at scale. And finally, in the past, one unifying organizing principle, if you like, that has sort of ensured that European policymaking has been coherent and consistent has been the push for greater economic and political integration. And in recent years, there have definitely been pressures on that. For instance, loosening state aid rules in the temporary crisis and transition framework, et cetera, that may reverse some of the progress we've been making on those fronts. So those pressures also have to be very vigilantly observed and taken into account. Back to you, Andre.
Yeah, next slide, please. The next items that we identified as an area that should be examined, it's something that should be on the list, is the successful policy and instrument to drive decarbonization. In principle, look, I grew up with the lesson that ETS is the cornerstone of, and it continues to be it continues to be a very important one. If nothing else, it changed the culture. And that is the most difficult thing to change. There's no doubt. I remember when I started as CEO of AIDA, and you will remember Sir Charles Nicholson, and what he said to me is, Andre, with his very British accent, he said, Andre, I don't know what the price of carbon is going to be in the future, but it's not going to be zero. So that kind of change has been a tremendous cultural change. And he's been driving it to some degree, especially over the last years. So currently, we would argue, and I think that, I think we know a little bit about ETS, that is a fit for purpose instrument. Currently, we think it is. It provides the fact that the price went from 5 to 80 and then to 100 and then to 50. I think that is the market, and people who don't like market, that's what it is. But what we need to understand is the fact that we are moving in a different world. And we're not talking about only about ETS. It's a whole array of instruments that will need to be that are currently on play that would need to be re-examined. But we looked in principle, especially at the ETS. And why we're saying this? We're saying this because there is going to be a change in the environment where we are going to an environment, or by 2038, 39, probably going to be run out of allowances or something like that. Now, if that is the case, the market is going to factor that in starting about 2033, 2034. That's what markets do. Now, if you're getting into a situation whereby price is going up, and the price is going down, and then you don't have any more allowances, I think it's something that you need to think about. How the liquidity is going to disappear in the market, that's going to make for a much more the price is going to be a lot more variable. You're going to be a lot more instability in the market, probably fewer players that are trading houses tend to have very high profit margins. The price is not what it needs to be, may not be there. So there will be a change in environment. And that change in environment needs to be taken into account. Now, what that means is that we need to think a little bit about what are the objectives for the ETS. And the objective for the ETS is quite clearly to be a cost-effective tool for decarbonization. It's not perfect. It's not going to be perfect. It's never going to be only ETS. But that is one of the cornerstones. This is why we use this instrument. And the second one is should provide an investment signal, a long-term price investment signal. But there's always going to be a tension between the price signal and the political acceptability of the price signal. I'm not telling you something new. You know this is coming from ETS too. We've seen it in many other areas. So an important element. The other, so what are the issues that should be examined, at least in our imagination, the things that could and should make the object of examination could include things like the architecture and the governance of the ETS. The architecture, we have the MSR now. Is the MSR going to continue in the same fashion? Does it have to be different? I don't know. Is the governance, the current governance that is being run like that? In the markets tend to move very, very fast. We're going to become in a very stable situation. Right now, we take a long time, many cases, to make changes to an ETS. Is the same governance. We're not offering necessarily a solution, and that's not because we're chicken. We're not offering a solution because we think that this needs to be part of a debate. And what I would like to also add is that the Commission is doing this debate. There is a program that is happening and that is being run with the help of advisors from outside the Commission. But it's something that really needs to be taken into account and moved on relatively quickly, because if you determine that you need to make changes, it's not something you do overnight. This is something that will take time to implement. Many people in this room are from different businesses. They are used to a certain system, convincing all the European institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, the Council. This is not something you do overnight. So again, our view is that you do need to look into it, and you need to look into it early, because it takes time to make any changes if necessary. Michael?
Thanks, Andre. Next slide, please. One theme that's pervading throughout the paper, but also through the consultations, interviews, et cetera, and you've heard it already several times, was the challenge of maintaining competitiveness in Europe. And it's a much bigger topic. I'm not going to be able to raise everything or mention everything that's in the paper, but a few specific things. So first of all, it was a very clear message in all the consultations and all the town halls, and not only from industry representatives, that a deindustrialized Europe, a Europe that loses its industrial base, is not going to be helpful, and not across many metrics. So for the environment, it wouldn't be helpful if relatively more efficient, relatively less carbon intensive European production wanders off offshores to regions where production tends to be more carbon intensive, and also other pollution, of course, tends to be less regulated. It wouldn't be good, of course, for security of supply of components, of materials, et cetera, in Europe. Some of those materials being critical to advance the targets on clean technology manufacturing. it wouldn't be good for European welfare and, of course, also to secure public support for the transition. So it really is a challenge and an important one to retain Europe's industrial base. And we already mentioned in previous slides that there's also a broader, really broader paradigmatic shift underway around the world in terms of economic relations, in terms of the importance and the sort of dynamic behind international trade. What afforded us access to low-cost raw materials, inputs, components, etc., but also consumer goods, and also gave European companies access to foreign markets, is now shifting to a landscape dominated more by industrial policy, by protectionist reflexes, by geopolitical considerations. That, of course, will have implications and also affect how Europe can continue competing around the world. There are, and this is where I really just picked two examples, there are some major policy changes underway to deal with this challenge of competitiveness. One is the CBAM, which will replace free allocation successfully starting in 2026. And it's already showing some remarkable effects. Sabine and I just mentioned, the CBAM effect around the world, countries accelerating carbon pricing, which is a very welcome and salutary effect for sure. But it still remains a new instrument for which we don't have empirical evidence on how well it will work. We know already that the design, for various reasons, legal reasons, political reasons, etc., will have some gaps, let's say. Let's try to use a neutral term, but since it does not deal with the export-related leakage, so European products sold in international markets will not benefit from protection under the CBAM. There will certainly be pressures downstream, substitution along the value chains. There's still questions about how to include indirect emissions. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about how well it will work. And that, of course, is something that reverberates greatly with European industry and questions about where to invest going forward, especially in the face of other jurisdictions like the United States rolling out their massive industrial policy strategies. And the second thing was energy costs. That kept coming up across the board. A really, really massive challenge, of course, to produce competitively and then also compete in international markets. But it's also a big challenge, for instance, with a view to advancing electrification. If electricity is significantly more expensive in Europe than in other jurisdictions, how can you then, it's a barrier to rapid electrification, which is key to decarbonizing a number of sectors. We also heard recommendations to reconsider restrictions on flexibility. The EU, for instance, has been very strict in its policies or in its attitude and approach towards using offset crediting, for instance, under the EU ETS after negative experiences in the second trading phase. And so with Article 6 coming up, etc., there's a question whether in future there shouldn't perhaps be a renewed discussion about allowing flexibility, which also would help European climate finance flows to developing countries. Also the question of technology neutrality, for instance, on hydrogen that Clemens already mentioned. And finally, something we heard especially in Paris, more than in the other capitals, was that there will be questions about the governance framework. It's certainly shown that there are some limits to what the EU, what Brussels can do, for instance, compared to Washington when it comes to industrial policy. But there may be questions about the own resources available to the EU and also other restrictions or strictures that are enshrined in the Constitution of Europe in the founding treaties. But that's, of course, a big question, a big debate, and nobody had specific recommendations or ideas on that.
Yeah, and next. Well, look, this is the last slide, so you'll be happy to hear that. But what the other thing that I want to say is that the paper is there, and I think it's quite elaborate in many of the points. The one thing we didn't say that we should have said at the beginning, and it is a little bit incumbent upon me to have said that is not about the Paris Agreement and climate change. Reaching the objectives of the climate change law and the Paris Agreement is not an issue under the debate. This is not what we're debating here, to be quite clear. What we are doing here is the fact that there is more than one road to implementation, and we're examining whether the road that we're taking is totally correct or that we need to make some correction in deviation. That's all we are talking about, and the issues need to be examined. Which brings us to the last point, and that is securing public transport support for the transition. We did some work at ERCST on public acceptance of CCS. And we started looking at this. We realized, look, I mean, you all live in Europe and in Brussels, and I'm not telling you anything new. You've seen these things that have happened on the streets here a few weeks ago. You've seen in Germany there have been issues around changing boilers in the Netherlands. So there is an issue of public acceptance that is coming up. It's a reality. It's not something we invented or we wanted or we don't want it. It's something that is there. So the question is the following: with the short-term and long-term socioeconomic impact of the transition becoming increasingly concrete, public support cannot be taken for granted. Now, when we started looking at this, my expectation was that I would find these numbers, and we did research. We found these numbers which would be very high. And I was extremely surprised looking at IMF and OECD numbers of public support and public acceptance of climate mitigation, climate policies, that there was a lot of support as long as we're talking about actions that implied subsidies. The moment you start talking about cost, you're not falling over a cliff, but it gets much, much softer. It gets much, much softer. So the idea is that there is a change of tone in discussions, and you have to open the Financial Times, you have to open the press, and you do see a change. It's a reality, something that we need to look. The areas that are critical for reaching the 2050 targets, such as CCS, still require a fair bit of work in terms of public acceptance. There are certain countries that have done very well, like Denmark. There are others that are much more at the beginning of the road. So there is the whole concept that we do need to work on public acceptance, and it's not an easy thing. I mean, in our view, and we're not necessarily providing a fundamentally interesting solution, I think that the people will listen if you tell them that it's going to cost something, but it's worth it. And I think that kind of coming up and saying, yes, this is what it's going to take, and we have to do it. And we've been through a lot of things in Europe that we had to do things, but it costs something. And I think that in order to secure public acceptance, the continuation of public acceptance, because there is a fair bit of support. Obviously, the parliament, all these laws that have been passed didn't come out of the blue. They came out of public support. Now we are in a situation where we are actually implementing it, and it's beginning to hurt people in the wallet. So we do need to make sure that that support is maintained, that this information is being fought, that we have clarity, that people understand what we're doing, and so on. So this is where we are. I mean, maybe we're not as convincing as we'd like to be in our presentation, but I think the paper is a lot more convincing. I can tell you that because it's a good paper. Read it, please. You can download it. It's available on the website. I think there were about 50 copies. We printed some copies, but not more. And we have invited a number of speakers to either kind of say nice things or criticize us. And it's fine. I mean, we are not immune to making mistakes or misinterpreting or people disagreeing with us. This is what it is. We are a think tank. It's an economic institute. I mean, this is a debate. It's an intellectual debate because it's the future of Europe at stake. It's not a joke. This is serious stuff. So we try to have a diverse panel, if you want, in every way possible. So I'll start and go this way, and I'll start that side with Nicola Rega from CEFIC. Nicola, what do you want to start first? And I'm introduce the speakers as we are. So let's try to keep it about 5 minutes or so.
Okay, no, sure, thanks. Was planning to be always on the last. Okay, that's good. That's thanks, Andre, for the opportunity to speak, and good afternoon, everybody. I had to say, with disclaimer, I was not part of the steering group and not part of the agreement of say nice things in the room. But I think this is a really good report, and I don't say that often. So I really invite everybody to have a look at it. It's just 30 pages with large margins, footnotes, graphics. So it's not that much to read, and it's really comprehensive. It touches all the key issues. I think it's a compass for us to work on in the coming weeks, months, and hopefully not that many years. This being said, I have to say something. So just allow me 3 points briefly. One is it's not explicitly mentioned in the document, but I think it's a bit of the red thread that follows, that connects all the points together, starting with the impact that we're having on the climate diplomacy and going all the way down in industrial competitiveness. To be able to be a leader and to make sure that everybody's leading, like we are leading and people are following. At the moment, I feel that countries are following us, but from not too much in a rush to take us in our policies. The issue is how do we make sure that we have a business case? That is the key issue in moving forward, because we cannot rely on an open-ended funding, public funding. As you mentioned also in the paper, funding is limited, it cannot go on forever. We need to create a business case where companies can find the raison d'etre for investing in Europe, and then and that will mobilize private capital much faster than public financing. The market pool is not there. Been discussing for at least a decade, if not more. It was relevant before, it's even more relevant today, where we are doing the next step in investment generation. Up until now, we managed to get along with something which was kind of getting back into business case with the energy efficiency, with a bit of fuel switching. Now we're doing the next step, where there's requiring, in most of the cases, high OPEX and certainly also higher CAPEX. We need to find a way that this cost is perceived all the way down the value chain. Doesn't mean we need to pass as such the cost, but it needs to be reflected. And then we need to allow for once the market to find the best way to deliver that, because market means innovation, means that we can manage to bring the cost down. But if we never try, we never succeed. Secondly, you touch in the report the fate of the ETS. That for us is crucial. There is a missing visibility at the moment. The 2040 communication says that if all the conditions are met, if all goes according to the plan, ETS goes to zero and the emissions are still in. That there is a fundamental issue. If we don't address that one, we can forget about most of the investments that we're now having in the pipeline. Because if we don't have the certainty of getting to zero in 2040, why bothering investing? Something which brings you to 20, 40, 50% reduction if you don't have the guarantee. That is a fundamental issue that will have an impact on all that we're discussing about the enabling conditions. So we need to find a solution, and I think it's important that we can have these occasions and others to sit together. Let's keep the incentive to decarbonize, but at the same time, let's keep the possibility for industries to operate in Europe. Last point, in the report, you talk about the issue of reshoring, bringing back activities, keeping activities in Europe. And I can understand and agree that there is a market, there is opportunities, there is economics, and we should not become autarkic in everything to be done in Europe. However, I would like to avoid that this becomes a new version of the Aesop fable of the fox and the grapes. Meaning, for the ones that don't forgot, it's like fox trying to get on the grapes. It doesn't manage after a few jumps, and then it says, okay, anyway, it was not mature enough. We are making things difficult in Europe for very good reasons, but it's difficult to make a business case. Now, let's not just say, well, because it's difficult, then we don't do it and we move production away from Europe. I heard it already so many times over the past months, it's kind of becoming almost a mantra. So let's make sure that we have the possibility of investing in Europe, and then let's have economics that are working, but economics needs to also be applied across the board.
Thank you, Nicola. Next to him is Liana Gura. I have to say this. Many of you have known John Cooper for many years because he was kind of a fixture in Brussels. Liana is the new head of Fuels Europe. Many of you will know her. Some of you may know her. Liana, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to join this panel. I'm really delighted and honored. This report on the priorities of the next institutional cycle couldn't be more timely, just a few months before the European elections. And on behalf of Fuels Europe, of fuels manufacturers, we welcome this report as it brings to the table aspects that, in our view, have been overlooked in the last few years, as well as some very clear recommendations for the upcoming legislative cycle. Well, after 5 years of this massive legislative effort through Green Deal, climate law, Fit for 55 package, now there is no doubt we should focus on implementation and delivery. In the meantime, as Andrei said, the world has changed and new challenges arose, such as energy security, dependence, affordability, resilience, industrial competitiveness, I would say green investments attractiveness, access to critical raw materials. All those parameters that, as I mentioned earlier, have been overlooked, or maybe I would say have been taken for granted. And now we have to address them. And we believe that in order to address them, we need some additional or alternative policy options and some corrective actions. And some of them are, have been identified in this report. I will focus on 3 major topics that are included in the report, and we believe that are really important, and how these topics, I will discuss how these topics impact our sector, our industry. So technology options, the cost of transition, and the role of the European industry. Starting with technology options. According to the report says that there is more than one pathway. And we couldn't agree more. But unfortunately, Europe has abandoned the principle of technology neutrality, and technologies have been selected and others have been banned, as we all know. And the report says as well that technology-specific support can be a costly mistake. I would say it can be even a fatal mistake. If capital-intensive investments are redirected away from Europe in other areas of the world, then this might be a point of no return. Climate ambition is so high that we don't have the luxury to exclude any CO2 reduction technology. And all of those technologies should be given room and space to mature and ramp up based on their CO2 reductions, on the speed of decarbonization they can achieve, on their cost, and the social impact. And it's not a matter of some kind of justice, let's say. It's simply a matter of cost. It's simply a matter of accelerating decarbonization than minimizing its cost. The lack of technology neutrality in decarbonization of transport, and more specifically in road transport, we believe is the most typical example. And we believe that this example should also be included in the report, because this lack of technology neutrality puts at risk the ramp up of renewable fuels, of the ramp up of renewable fuels that Europe will need in order to achieve its targets for sectors such as aviation and maritime. Second, very important topic, the cost of transition. We all know that the cost of transition will be huge for economies, societies, and industries. Starting with economies, we fully support the idea of prioritizing instruments with minimum cost for a given CO2 reduction. And I would say, going even further, we would support prioritization according to CO2 reduction based on a life cycle analysis and all embedded costs. The cost for societies. Social acceptance of the cost and burdens of these climate policies should not be ignored. And citizens should not only be given financial incentives, but also they should be given alternative options, and they should be given, finally, the freedom of choice. And as we saw in the survey that is included in this report, people do not want bans. People like the support, for example, of electric vehicles, probably the vehicles that most of the citizens cannot afford, but they do not agree with bans. They want to have alternative options. The cost for industries. No doubt, the cost will be huge in order to transform existing assets and in order to invest in new ones. And for this, Europe needs to become an attractive place for these green investments. And in order to become attractive for these green investments, I agree with Nicola, Europe has to create business cases and has to create also lead markets. Funding instruments, carbon price, EU ETS, energy taxation have a crucial role to play in this. And last but not least, we believe that the carrot and stick mix of policies should be reconsidered, taking into account lessons and best practices from our global competitors. In our sector, in fuel manufacturing, investments in renewable fuels will be needed to achieve aviation and maritime targets, as I said earlier, but a lead market is not in place. And road transport could be the ideal lead market for the ramp up of renewable fuels production and their cost reduction, which finally is the ultimate goal. And we hope that the review clauses of LDV and HDV regulation will give the opportunity for corrective actions. And coming to the last third important topic, the role of industry in Europe. Well, we all agree, I guess, that European industry will have a pivotal role in delivering the Green Deal, in complementing and supporting Green Deal to be delivered. But in the meantime, European industry should decarbonize, should transform to produce net zero products, while remaining competitive in order to ensure the security of supply of all those essential goods that will be needed in the transitional phase. And enabling conditions should be in place. As I already said, Europe has to become attractive for green investments, both in new assets and in transforming the existing ones. Competitiveness should be guaranteed because it is a prerequisite for the security of supply, and instruments such as CBAM, EU ETS post-2030, access to critical supply chains will be important to secure this competitiveness. And of course, the call for a new industrial deal, complementing and supporting the implementation of the Green Deal is more relevant than ever. And I will conclude by saying a few words regarding our sector, fuels industry. We are producers of both conventional and renewable fuels. We are one of the strategic industrial sectors in Europe, ensuring energy security and resilience to the EU. And for this reason, we need to be strong and competitive. The good news for our industry is that the transition has already started, and we intend and hope that we will have the enabling framework to implement our multi-billion investment plans in Europe in order to supply the renewable fuels that Europe will need in the coming years. I leave it here for now, and I hope that we will have an interesting discussion later on.
Thank you, Liana. We'll now shift gears a little bit, and Sabine Frank, who's the head of Carbon Market Watch. I think, Sabine, your comments will be a little bit different from what we've heard so far.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you, Andre, for the invitation. Yes, I am from a not-for-profit advocacy organization. I am from an NGO, so as such, I think I will be the nuisance element this afternoon, but I'm the only one, so I suppose the doses will be healthy rather than toxic, and Andre said that he can take it, so let's see what I can do. Andre, you've already mentioned in one of your later remarks that the paper clearly states that achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement and the objectives set out in the European climate law cannot be subject to debate. And I will say, first of all, I was relieved to see that in the paper. So it is good that the what is not in question, it's only the how of how to get there. The implementation is in question. However, what I think the paper does not address is the danger that even in the focus on the how, the what, that is the targets and their implementation might slip a little. And neither does the paper pay attention to the impending 2040 target setting. I think the 2040 target setting is only mentioned once in passing in the paper. So it neglects the fact that The climate law is due to be amended, so it doesn't talk about in what way, how it should be amended, and that thereafter all other EU climate and energy laws, in theory, will be amended. Again, I think if the authors don't question the Paris Agreement and don't question the European climate law as it is now, then setting a 2040 target should be a major focus of the paper. It matters to set another ambitious interim target on the way to climate neutrality by 2050, because this is about setting the pace and doing the emissions reductions earlier rather than leaving them for later. And what also matters in our view is to take this opportunity to get away from the climate law just stating a net target and instead separate the targets out in the climate law. So have one target for emission reductions, one for biological carbon removals, and a third one for engineered carbon removals. Now, why is that important? If we separate out those targets, then it's also an opportunity to get clarity on the roles that each of those types of actions has in solving the climate crisis. And what's more, and if you're industry representatives, I think you'll like that argument, separate target then also allow for dedicated incentivization policy. So for example, if we are all clear that we need permanent atmospheric carbon removals and that we need to scale up the industries that will deliver them, a clear target in the climate law will help this along. My second observation is I was surprised by how often the concept of sustainability featured in the paper. There is mention of sustainable transition, sustainable EU climate policy, sustainable EU leadership even, sustainable implementation of the European Green Deal. Then there's even explicit mention of there being 3 dimensions of sustainability: environmental, social, and economic. Now, I'd like to advocate today for reserving the term sustainability for the planet and its boundaries and use other terms for all these other things. We can talk about tolerability, acceptability, but with sustainability, we're talking about the planets and its limits and its tipping points. These are the absolutes that are at stake, and the rest is a matter of design, of the application of human ingenuity, and of negotiation of interest and needs. Now, I'm from Carbon Market Watch, and as the name suggests, we deal with carbon markets, and in the EU context with the European emissions trading system in particular. So my attention was also piqued when the ETS popped up here and there. It wasn't just in one chapter, it is mentioned in several places. And that is, although the focus of the paper is on implementation of the European Green Deal having to be through policy tools that are as such not climate policy tools, but nevertheless the emissions trading system as one of the important climate policy tools keeps popping up. And the comments on the ETS in the text, they all go in the direction of claiming a market-only approach for decarbonization and deeming other policy instruments as cost ineffective, as overlapping, and as not technology neutrals. Now, the other policy instruments aren't always explicitly mentioned, but I assume implied are such things as the renewable energy targets and the energy saving targets. And here I'd like to counter that wanting to rely on the EU ETS alone is a rather old school way of thinking. It does look nice in theoretical economist handbooks, but in order to deal with the complex task of decarbonization, we need this complementary approach. And the European way of developing integrated climate and energy packets, so the ETS working hand in hand with other targets and measures, has actually been proven successful, and even in delivering and even outperforming the climate targets agreed by policymakers. There's also talk of the ETS as a driver for decarbonization that needs to be reviewed and have so-called compliance flexibilities introduced. The suggestions which are then made, they are tentative and they are framed in the need for debate, which is very nice, I think. But in the list that is given there, I think we can already identify a number of the ideas as unsuitable. For example, the reintegration in international carbon markets, which alludes to allowing international offset credits back into the ETS. I know this is understood to be in the distant future, but I'd say there is currently no prospect of international carbon credits which would have the climate integrity to be able to serve as offsets or even match the price level of EUAs. And although there are arguments made about this constituting climate finance, I'd say if the EU generated demand in international carbon credits, the EU would actually effectively compete with other countries for the achievement of their nationally determined contribution. So I think international offset credits have been excluded from the ETS for a good reason. I'd be very cautious about advocating for their reintroduction. The other form of compliance flexibility invoked is the integration of carbon removals in the ETS. This is currently a very popular idea with everybody who wants carbon removals incentivized, because the incentive for scaling up the technologies needed and the investment needed need to be created. But can they truly be created by the EU ETS? Is the EU ETS suitable as an incentivization tool? And there I would maintain that the quantities of removals, that is atmospheric and permanent removals needed, they are unlikely, the demand that can be, the quantities of removals that are eventually needed are unlikely to be satisfied with any demand that can be created by actors in the EU ETS. Of course, this debate is also held with a view to solving the liquidity problem. So there are two potential problems and solutions here at stake. But even as a solution to the supposed problem of a lack of liquidity of emission allowances in the EU ETS endgame, I'm not so sure that this is going to it's going to be a good idea. If we already hold out the prospect for removals in the ETS, it's likely to affect the decarbonization effort that is going to be made. We have a very long way yet to get to the point where we can claim residual emissions. So let the decarbonization efforts be made first before we talk about carbon removals coming to the rescue. And my last point, I don't know, I haven't timed myself, Andre. I hope I can still make that one last point very quickly.
Sabine, do I look like I'm going to interrupt you?
Okay, especially since I'm providing you with food for thought. Yeah, I hope. My last point is when the paper in the places where the paper talks about policy interlinkages and the need for the recalibration of priorities, I don't argue with that as such. The recommendation is that this should happen in recognition of the necessary conditions to succeed in this interlinked environment. And one example that is given here is the deployment of carbon capture and use, carbon capture and storage, and carbon direct removals methods and activities. And I think what we need to note here is that all these technologies are potentially compatible with an ongoing reliance on fossil fuel production and consumption, when actually we should be heading for a fossil fuel phase out. I mean, I also know that fossil fuels still have their role to play, but nevertheless, we all know we need to leave fossil fuels behind eventually. So what would we be doing by incentivizing in a large way the deployment of CCU, CCS, and CDR? Let me limit it to CCU and CCS. We don't even have the proper governance systems for them in place yet. We haven't concluded the debate yet of which residual and unabatable emissions these technologies should eventually be legitimately used for. And finally, I wonder how the call for the deployment of these technologies sits with the demand for technology neutrality, which is held up high in other places of the paper. But I'm sure I'll be getting an answer to that. Thank you.
And very good fighting words, Sabine. I tell you what, I was once at the panel at the WEF and with some very well-known person chairing. And this well-known person can end up with a head like a panel, something like this. But this person was the chairperson of the room was a woman, kept answering everything that the panel say and every question. And in the end, we all sat there and said nothing. So as a chair, I'm not going to answer any of these things. I think that the thing to do is absolutely welcome. And I think the criticism and the observations that you make, I think we're perfectly fine to listen because we all have different views. And this is what a think tank is, and think tanks are. It's about intellectual debate for policymakers to make decisions. That's what think tanks are. Therefore, if they're not to be an echo chamber. So now I'm sure this is not going to be another echo chamber because next is Yvonne Schlingenberg, the acting deputy director general of DG Klima. Yvonne, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, André. I wasn't sure whether you would maybe first go to Koen and Gabrielle and Charles and then come to me, but it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I don't ask for any,
that was strategic.
any privileged treatment. And I was actually going to keep it rather short because also I don't want to now react to nor everything that's in your report, nor that the others have said so far. Of course, I think on every topic we could have a long discussion, but I also wanted to acknowledge that, you know, I think you've set out to do this work at a very good moment because yes, you're not the only think tanks, I have to say, that are of course in this process, and it is much appreciated. I mean, it is the right moment. You know, we are certainly also within the Commission having a lot of reflections. So any, you know, input and advice and comparison and analysis is very good and very useful. I'm happy that the report, you know, recognizes the achievements and of course also the changing circumstances. I think that is also to some extent common knowledge, or at least, you know, commonly agreed. It is a little bit difficult also for me, I have to acknowledge that, you know, to read it completely objectively, because of course, you know, I have been part in crafting all these policies, etc. And I can tell you we've done our utmost also in the art of what is possible. I think we very much have to acknowledge that. I think you tend to say that, André, in meetings. So yeah, I mean, we can, you know, go back to all kinds of considerations, but in the end, you know, also climate policy is the art of what is possible and acceptable. So I sometimes feel a little bit, but that may be my perception, that the report is a bit fueling this perception of, you know, criticism on the Green Deal, on climate policy. Now, I know you put in the disclaimers and you said this is not here to contest that, but I think that is indeed, it came at the end. It is very important to keep that in mind, because what I do very much agree with is what you said, that, you know, we have to explain why we're doing this, you know, what it implies, that it is costly. And Clemens, I don't think, at least when you state that, you know, there is often it is stated that this comes for free. I have never seen that on the side of the Commission, for example. Okay, there may be others, I don't know exactly who they are. But I would rather see the glass as half full. And I also think we need to, like Sabine was saying, keep in mind that, of course, we always review and, where needed, revisit the policy. But I think we need to put that against the backdrop of also, you know, predictability and regulatory stability. I mean, that is something we also hear a lot. So yeah, and of course that doesn't mean that you can't review, but I actually think I heard different voices now from both Nicola and Liana and Sabine on the end of the ETS. So that in itself, I presume, already creates some unpredictability. Just to say that also on the side of the Commission, and I decided not to comment much on the ETS because of course, my colleagues who are in charge of the ETS in DG Klima are having these discussions with all of you. So I think that is, I will not, you know, tread into that. So yes, review and revisit where needed. What I think is very, very important is to very much always strive for a factual discussion. I think that was one of my comments in this process to back up, any of these things that are being said in the interviews and, that you hear a lot with facts. I mean, this goes for all sectors. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation. So why are certain things, what is behind certain statements, etc. And then I can link that to our most recent, product, basically, which is the communication on securing our future. I think there's very little attention to the title of this communication that came out on the 6th of February, where we actually try to do all that. We try to flag that what it is, why we need to do this, what are the challenges, but also looking at the opportunities, very much also indeed acknowledging and pointing to the changing circumstances, which then point to the need for additional policies, etc., that should be developed in the new mandate. We do that on the basis of our own analysis. We do impact assessments. They are done on the same basis for all policy proposals. So I'm afraid, GDP is one of the things we have to look at. I mean, I already explained in our previous sessions, Clemens, that I'm not an economist. So consumption, we can, of course, look at that as well. And I think it is very true. And that is at a higher level, of course, fully acknowledge that, we have so many challenges right now in Europe that, of course, we do need to look at, where to put our efforts. But I think, again, in a fact-based manner, we need to look at if we don't act now, I don't think it will be getting any better, frankly. So, metrics, I think there are a zillion metrics. I was just showing Clemens the report by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Fortunately, that report shows that, investments are booming massively. Of course, it also indicates that we need many more investments, but those are the things we really need to talk about. And then I'm also always wondering, maybe again, as a non-economist, about the cost efficiency, because that again is something that we hold very, very dearly. And I think always that is why we do these impact assessments, not to stride into approaches that would have extra costs. That doesn't mean that they can't be chosen, but to at least make it transparent. And that again brings us back to acceptability. So cost and benefits, we should explain how it is and that it's worth it, as you said, and exactly what that is composed of, all the different costs and benefits, etc. And then what else did I want to say? Basically I can end by saying that I think, as I said, in this communication, we flag all the things we do want to discuss. You, I think, mentioned, André, that the Commission has started discussing, not just on ETS, but pretty much on all sectors in society that are going to be affected by this transition. And in fact, not just by the green transition, but by many other transitions, be it digital, be it geopolitical, be it, populism, what have you. So we try to put forward, the challenges, but also the opportunities. We are very much looking forward to having this dialogue and to together craft solutions. You did say, look, not now for solutions, but at some stage, I was thinking, if I'm called into the Berlaymont and they say, have you seen this report? They say we should do this and that. So what is it we should do differently? And I think that I would invite you all to, will be the next piece of work. We kind of start digging into what exactly it should be. Thanks.
Any good think tank?
That was-
Oops. Any good think tank, Yvonne, just was waiting for that. The encouragement that we have something to do after this. Look, we'll certainly circle back and look at the one thing, the temptation in these meetings is always to end up in the bilateral with the Commission. So I was actually trying to avoid that.
Good.
Charles, Électricité de France company that I've known since I was young. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, André, Clemens, and Michael. So it's a bit, let's say, hard to go after Yvonne. So I will be definitely very humble because I'm not a policymaker. At least, so I'll try to offset that by being an economist. Just maybe a few remarks, very humble remarks as an economist, and trying to be, let's say, relevant for the real world, but fully aware that at the end of the day, the policymakers are making the tough decisions. Maybe one first point, which is very interesting in your paper, Clemens, André, and Michael, is about the macroeconomics of the transition. It is maybe not the first paper doing it, but it is extremely clear in your paper to start with that trade-off between macroeconomics and climate ambition. It is a trade-off, so we need to be fully aware about those supply side issues. As Yvonne said, we still need to talk about GDP, but to focus on consumption, to focus on the cost of the transition is let's say maybe the first start point for this discussion. To be aware of the trade-off. At the end of the day, it is not up to the economist to balance and to decide on the trade-off, but at least to frame it, the trade-off between macroeconomics and climate, because
Macroeconomics need to look at the cost of inaction. which is
indeed,
often not
yeah,
the case.
with the counterfactual. So indeed, there's a cost of inaction. In the impact study of the Commission, there is a very detailed piece about the cost of inaction. And so that's clear. Also, as Sabine said, you do have planetary boundaries. So there are sailings. You should take it as a granted. And so you need to take that as a constraint in your economic optimization. However, you also have, I would say, flaws because of your economic subsistence. And so this is why, I mean, I'm sure Sabine is fully aware of this literature about the donut, but all that we are doing to try to position ourselves into the donut between the flaws of economic subsistence and the sailings of planetary boundaries. This is key to be explicit about it and to try to quantify as Clemens did it. The second and last, let's say, initial trade-off is about trade. And so again, I think it's very useful and thought-provoking to put it very, let's say, high in the agenda in the paper, that you do have a trade-off between your climate ambition locally, I would say, within the EU, and let's say, your borders, what happens in terms of level playing field, climate distortions, because this is, let's say, dimensioning the climate ambition you can realistically have. Obviously, it is endogenous, so you need to have a key, this is your first action about international cooperation, CBAM, which is great. The signaling effect of a CBAM is actually very powerful. And so it's obviously the Commission is showing the way, and now we need to just, let's say, patch the holes and let's say accelerate this this agenda. And as soon as the Commission, the policymakers did set climate target, taking into account those two trade-offs, all that needs to be done by the industry, basically the energy sector, as far as I'm concerned, is basically to just optimize. This is a very economist view, but maybe it's an older way, as Sabine said, but still very useful to think, starting with the models, how to minimize the cost and implement it in an efficient way. For that, maybe just two quick comments about the first best. The kind of first best energy mix we should aim at. This one, is highly uncertain. So this is why technological neutrality is not a buzzword. It's just because there's a lot of technological uncertainties. I mean, talked about the uncertainty about CCS. I'm sure Gabriel will come back to that. I just want to come up with another one about decarbonized thermal power production capacity. I think it's a hard fact for the power sector that there will be flexibility needs, and the flexibility needs because of renewables penetration are increasing massively. And this is great that you do have more and more renewables, intermittent renewables such as wind and solar, but they're creating massive intermittency and massive flexibility needs. So you need something to put it in front of it. Today, in France, we do have nuclear. In other countries, some of other countries do not have nuclear. Today, they have carbonized thermal. Tomorrow, there's a big uncertainty on how they're going to be able to produce electricity in a dispatchable way, and they will have to produce electricity in a dispatchable way because it's also a hard technological point. Batteries not do the trick for long-term flexibility. So this is a technological hard fact to be analyzed, to be innovated into. So very highly uncertain, but this is a strong call for technological neutrality because of the technicalities of the power system. And maybe my last point is about implementation, because as soon as we have some kind of first best energy mix in mind, but we need to be humble about it. And then there's the technical discussion between my teams, the Commission's team about the respective specific role, let's say, role of different technologies, how much electrons in the system, how much molecules in the system, and so on. But at the end of the day, as far as implementation is concerned, you really need to have something harmonized. So harmonized means, so I would push back a bit on what Michael said about what he heard in France. Also, if it was in France, it was not by me, because we definitely do not want, to basically, let's say, decentralize even more, let's say, the power and the decision making process back to the member states. We do think actually the Commission should ramp up even more in terms of decision making. As far as CO2 pricing is concerned, we do think this is absolutely a key priority. It's a bit an old school way, but I think it's very sound to come back to CO2 pricing because of this technological certainty. And for that, the Commission needs to be, let's say, drive at the driving seat. The ETS, will have to be strengthened, but this is a technical discussion. I do not want to dwell too much into it. But in terms of governance, the Commission should basically think jointly about CO2 pricing, the consistent level of CO2 pricing with the level of climate ambition, climate target, and the redistribution measures, competitiveness issue, and this can only be done at the EU level. So this is very clear. A lot of distortions within the EU that are deteriorating the single market today comes from a lack of harmonization about state aids. And so this is your homework. Homework. Obviously, the Commission is on it, but for the next Commission, it's definitely a key priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Next is Gabriel Gauthier from Total Energies, company that is in full transition, I take it. Gabriel.
Yes, thank you, Andre, and thank you for inviting us to this, to be a member of this advisory group. Perhaps I'll try and use the topic from the point of view of a company which is working on two pillars. One, of course, very much still on fossil, and the other one investing massively renewables, wanting to be part of the solution and having big targets and ambitions in renewables. What we're not here to, we were not here in this group to challenge the fact that climate required an urgent response, and this has been the case. And thank you very much from the Commission to raised it. We were just wanting to highlight that perhaps some circumstances, the Green Deal was before the crisis in Ukraine, before perhaps the awareness that we were facing strong international competition, both in the US, from the Chinese, who are going their own way, but decarbonizing also quickly, but having chosen other ways, other pathways. So we cannot just say, as still is sometimes the belief here in Brussels, that the US is climato-sceptic. Not at all. They have chosen another way. And developing economies are also embracing the decarbonization, because now we all agree, and we have seen that with the COP, that the problem is not Europe and we cannot drag the world, but the global south is the problem, and we should help them with this. That's also. So perhaps these circumstances have changed, and perhaps some implications have been underestimated, and some beliefs were a little wrong. First of all, that the Green Deal was perhaps based on the fact that the EU industry embracing the Green Deal in itself would boost the competitiveness of the industry. No. So second belief is that we underestimated the cost, that was said many times, of decarbonization, that did not in itself right away bring new competitiveness to the industry. Third, that the renewable energy would be much less costly because the marginal cost of renewable is less. That is perhaps in the long term, but in the for a number of in the transition period, huge investments will not drag down the price of energy and electricity. Third, perhaps that we assumed that leading the world, teaching the world, would lead the others to change at the same pace as we are changing. That was perhaps a lack of awareness of where we stand today, and the relative weight of Europe in the world. We will, by 2050, only account for 13% of the world GDP, which was not the case before. And we have lost 30% of global market share in industry added value in the last years. We are facing a demographic decline. We are facing geostrategic weaknesses, a lack of consensus on major policies, immigration, common defense policy, and the like, and a rise of populism. Let's face it, also a hostile stance towards a sort of green fatigue. Now, we have to be aware of this, and we just wanted to say we are facing these challenges together, and we have to face this. Now, and the lessons we learned also from the crisis, but don't want to be too gloomy, we're positive also. The value of the EU single market. We saw the value of solidarity to avoid shortages. We saw the value of long-term contracts to secure supply. We saw the growing renewable contribution to a sound and efficient security of supply is increasing EU's resilience. So that's our positive. And we saw the value of energy efficiency gains, which must not be confounded by, unfortunately, demand destruction, which is massive also. We can't boost that the gas demand is plateauing because 1/3 is coming from industrial demand destruction. So that's not so positive, but we must still make progress on energy efficiency. Now, the crisis has led us to facing and to noting new existing risks on dependency of raw materials. Security of supply, of course, is one big thing, and then the cost of decarbonization. Perhaps some of the gaps, and this is understandable. We rush perhaps too quickly with not enough impact assessments on some texts, and we think some of the targets are going to be difficult to reach. Solar targets might be reachable. Offshore wind targets won't be reachable. And some of the renewable targets won't be reached because of the underinvestment in the grids and in flexibility. These are two issues that perhaps have been underestimated. We have 500 gigawatt in Europe awaiting for connection today. So the grid is big forgotten perhaps, and the flexibilities. The hydrogen, we have bet perhaps put too much emphasis on hydrogen. We are one of the biggest users of hydrogen, so we are the first victim of that. And we issued a tender for 500 kiloton per year. We badly need that to produce RFNBOs, to decarbonize our refineries. We won't find them in Europe. We are almost sure we won't find them in Europe. We'll need to import them perhaps. So we are building, and I will come to the new international partnerships we need to develop with the countries and the neighboring countries, which are absolutely crucial. I fully agree with Liana when she says we have been not given enough place on technology neutrality. I want to elaborate on this, but in many things, in mobility with no life cycle analysis taking into account, in the color of hydrogen, the endless color of hydrogen. One of the reasons hydrogen is not competitive is because we only want green hydrogen and not nuclear hydrogen to fill our electrolyzers. Now let's be a little more flexible and build a hydrogen economy, decarbonized hydrogen economy in Europe. Of course, we have suffered, it's true, not enough, perhaps carrots and too many sticks. The IC ban in itself won't be sufficient to foster an electricity market. We see that it is costly and it needs other things. Do not speak about the CSRD. Just one thing, the US SEC today is not asking, just decided not to ask about Scope 3 reporting. So that's a big issue. I'm finished there, Andre. And last but not least, I mean, we need to perhaps urgently develop these investments and these PPP and redirect ETS resources to new investments. We need to have an efficient CCS. We want a carbon price. We want a single European market for carbon removal certification. And we would love harmonization with the rest of the world. So it has to have an international recognition of the decarbonization efforts we do in neighboring countries, in Africa, for instance, both in NBS and in our own greenhouse gas reductions. And again, we would encourage new partnerships with the rest of the world. We can't afford to have barriers and taxes on PV. This will block the Green Deal. But we want to encourage a diversification of supply chains. We want to avoid restricting measures, and we want to encourage partnerships with the Global South, guarantee so that we can invest in the Global South, to embrace the Global South and to foster and to have develop a win-win relationship. But before jumping perhaps too quickly on 2040 targets, it's just paper. We want to have a real assessment of the difficulties, the challenges of the 2030 targets already, and foster investments and foster social acceptance, affordability for the people. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I was looking at my paper and I was actually scrapping point by point as we went along the table. So have a very nice evening, everybody. Well, I didn't get applause for that. I mean, Yvonne was the only one who got applause for her intervention so far. But let me maybe put a little bit more emphasis on a few points. First of all, André and team, congratulations with the report. I think it's a very good report. If I were to structure it according to what we need, also as an industry, I would make a few points which again reflect what has already been said today. First of all, we are in the phase of implementation of the Green Deal. I mean, as an industry, and I'm proud to work for this industry, and I must even say more proud than 10 years ago, this industry has projects in place, is executing these projects, and we are implementing the Green Deal and our own roadmap. So I think that's the positive element and the positive message I wanted to bring. As an industry, we are committed to the Green Deal, and maybe a segue into the Antwerp Declaration and basically tribute to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. It was the chemical industry that basically pulled that initiative, but has been collecting the energy-intensive industries around it. I think the Antwerp Declaration is the industrial deal requirement to complement the Green Deal, not to do away with the Green Deal. I think it's a core complement to the Green Deal, which goes to how to execute the Green Deal. When you look at the report, a little bit in the report, there is a suggestion to say maybe we need to change the Fit for 55 legislation. I'm not really in agreement with that, apart from ETS revision, etc., that needs to be done. But I think we need to implement and execute the Fit for 55 legislation. Some are talking about the Fit for 1990 legislation. I don't think we need new legislation. We need legal security, and then it's coming to the execution of some of the initiatives being taken. Maybe, if I may, one point in the report where you're a little bit too negative is about the carbon capture and the acceptance of carbon capture. I agree public acceptance is difficult, but to say that it is not really accepted by policymakers, I don't think that that is correct. We have the Industrial Carbon Management Communication, we have the Net Zero Industry Act that all fully recognize the storage, carbon capture and use. And I think that is essential for our industry going forward, but it needs to be executed right now. We have carbon capture projects. 2/3 of our emissions are process related. That's not combustion related, it's process related. And in all of these plants, we also try to implement renewable energy to basically power the plant. So it is going to be renewable energy, but permitting again plays a role there as well. But carbon capture remains important. Carbon use is essential, but we need clarity on the carbon use from industrial sources. I like to hear the view that, yeah, but we're going to do it with direct air capture and biogenic sources. We're going to need between 280 and 420 million tons of CO2 for a variety of applications. We did a study on that with VITO, the Flemish Research Institute. 69 to 70% available will come from biogenic sources. Direct air capture at this stage is estimated at 3 million tons, by 2030. No estimate for 2050 with huge energy costs. So the question is, how are we going to provide the market between 280 and 420? So that's a question that I think is important. Second point, public support. I mean, I see the paper focusing on that, saying it's going to be expensive. Public support will be needed. I think it's important to have a coordination of all the finance instruments. I see on your page 13 an enumeration of all the European initiatives. Very good. The Commission is saying, great that we now have projects under the Innovation Fund. Yes, but the Innovation Fund is 8 times oversubscribed in the last round. And I think we need to make sure that the projects are helped and are helped in a way which is coordinated. The state aid rules are there, but if you look at the emergency state aid regime, the matching clause requires you to be active in 4 or 5 countries where you have low income regions. At the same time, you have the climate and or the transition fund, just transition fund, which is very pockets, regional pockets. Yeah. The modernization fund, which is more energy related than decarbonization related. The RRF, which runs off in 2026, so we're not really sure what is going to happen afterwards. So a coordination and a pooling of funding opportunities, I think, is an important element there. It was mentioned before, access to electricity, access to reasonable priced electricity, but also availability. The Commission is rightfully saying that in the communication 2040, 17 gigawatt of renewables has been added. I agree. I'm not sure that we will still reach the targets that were set forth. And then couple that with the reform of the electricity markets. Was that reform deep enough? If you don't reach the targets, if you have to count on flexibility, you have to count on capacity mechanisms, is that going to bring the certainty and the price certainty in the markets, or are we going to have fluctuation in the markets, which was actually designed to be avoided by the reform of the electricity? So I think new reform of electricity market is an important point going forward. Market uptake of low carbon products, I think, is an important element. We don't decarbonize just for the sake of decarbonizing the cement industry. We decarbonize to put low carbon products on the market. There, I think interaction between the upstream legislation and the downstream legislation is essential. You have the ETS and the carbon removals legislation, but you also have product-specific legislation. The CO2 that I capture in a plant, how am I going to translate that into the product-specific EPDs? I think that's an important question that we need to resolve. And I think that also comes back to legal certainty. Also, when it comes to, for instance, the allowances running off in 2040, is that an unintended consequence of the application of the linear reduction factor till 2030, not really looking at 2040, or was it intended? And if it was intended, how to square the circles with other legislation? The 20% worst performing plants in Europe need to provide a carbon neutrality plan, but that is for 2050. So how do we want to be carbon neutral by 2040, or have to be, or is it 2050? And what are we going to fill the gap between 2040 and 2050? Carbon removals, questionable. I mean, these are issues. Again, these are not criticisms which mean to be too critical. I think a lot has been done, that's what I said before. New initiatives have been taken, very positive. I would also be positive on the point that you raise in the report on the making sure that we have the citizens with us and the public acceptance. I think we need to find a way. I mean, I'm going back a long time now. I'm a little bit of a dinosaur, but actually I was around in 1985 when the White Book was presented, 300 measures that goes into the single market in 1992. That was a project that everybody in Europe was aware of. I think that the Fit for 55 in this room is known, but is not known to the citizens. What can you do to contribute? How can we provide you incentives to contribute? So I think, and I hope that we can take citizens along on this road. Again, to end on one point, what is a little bit missing in the report, if I may, not in the report, but what is a little bit missing on that social aspect is taking the workers with us and the skills going forward. Decarbonizing our industry means that we need to make sure that our workers are also reskilled, that there is indeed existing workforce that is reskilled. New employees are attracted to a business which is decarbonized. I think that will require a huge effort from both national and European institutions. That's a point that I will end on. A lot of issues in the Green Deal and 5 require a close cooperation between national authorities. Talk about infrastructure, talk about permitting, talk about access to electricity. This is all national plus Europe. I wanted to end.
Look, we've heard a variety of views, and some of them more positive, some of them more negative, and we welcome them all. I mean, frankly, I don't expect this to be the report to end all reports. But what I would also say is there's only one speaker here that received some applause, and that was Yvonne. So, Yvonne, do you want to? Can I come back to you for a moment?
Yeah, it's on still. We
Yes,
don't need to push the
it's-
button.
It's,
Okay.
it's always on. That's the danger.
No, that's fine. We were behaving. No, I'm not. No, very, very interesting points. Clearly, I'm glad to hear I'm not the only one who either looks at it, half glass, half full. I just added some water. And I think that is important also for this public acceptance, because we do get a lot of, this fatigue, this backlash. I even, learned a week ago, the green lash. I mean, frankly, let's look at the facts. We want to stay the course in this transition? Does the industry need predictability? If we do, then yes, we can talk about the changing circumstances. I think it was very clear when interest rates went up, inflation went up. Okay, nobody will dispute that, but we do need to look at what caused that. The regulatory burden, and we didn't talk about agriculture here today, but I mean, there is nothing in the Fit for 55 that puts anything on farmers. Huh? So let's be very clear. I just think we need to, because it doesn't help, if we're not clear about what is driving what and the trade-offs. So again, yes, let's talk about that. Let's take stock of the new insights and where we indeed need additional clarity. But let's not put everything into question. Let's have these open debates. I think also Sabine made relevant comments, but I think they need to be part of those discussions. Where do cost efficiency and certainty and the transition, do they always meet? No, I don't think they always meet. So and that needs to come out clearly. I think, as I said, we try to do our share. I was very bad in not mentioning also our carbon management, industrial carbon management communication, because indeed we try to flag there in more technical terms what we think would be needed in order to also be able to tap into that technology. I think we maintain that we very much pursue technological neutrality, but in combination with cost efficiency. I mean, and I always say, look, I hope that also people, when they implement, they look at cost efficiency and at public acceptance, because that's in the end indeed what it's all about, right? And I mean, we do that, and that's how we inform the policy making. And then, of course, it goes into the wild with the actual decision makers, So, and I hope it's in everybody's interest that we very much, compare analyses, notes, lessons learned on the ground, because yes, we acknowledge that, things we're not, not nor we nor the decision makers have always the ultimate truth, and notably when things change. So I think we're in this moment in time that we need to very much work on implementation. In doing that, try and provide the clarity that is needed where it isn't there yet. Try and provide the support where it is needed and it isn't there yet. Very much pooling, as you all said, I think, the different resources. What is not in your paper is the ETS revenues per se. 100 billion over the decade, I think, is not neglectable. So yeah, and I think I very much also agree, and I didn't mention it in my intervention, but we're very much on that line. I mentioned dialogue and discussion and, looking at solutions and how to work them out. But the cooperation and the coordination is extremely important. And I think that is what you see now in us setting up, or Mrs. von der Leyen rather, setting up these dialogues, really to see, where can the EU provide added value? Where do we need to talk with member states authorities? Where can lessons be learned? I mean, we had a very interesting session last week with member states, both from energy and climate ministries, and we had them present their success stories. And there are many things that people try in one way or the other, and that can be relevant, be it in terms of public acceptance, be it in terms of permitting, be it in terms of renovations or whatever. So, and I think that is great. That is what Europe can help with. And last point is indeed on the international cooperation. This is a little bit, we've always been as active as we could on that front. I think we can still, for the next mandate, also look at a better alignment of what we call the external European policies and our internal commitments. So that is also fine. But yeah, it will remain a bit of a chicken and egg discussion, the speed of action at EU level, how much is that triggering action in other countries. But I think what is true is what Gabriel was saying is that, this race is on. So we better, make the most of it.
Well, look, if I can, with your indulgence, I'll take two questions. I mean, it's not what we normally are about. We normally prefer to have a lot more discussion from the floor, but in this case, I think this went a little bit longer, and I will take some of the blame for that. But I will take two questions. I think there's a gentleman over there, and I don't know if there's a second question or you're all running for the drinks. And Emanuele. So if you're honest, who has the microphone? Okay, can you pass on the microphone, please? If you
Thank
want to
you.
introduce yourself, let's keep it short, not,
Sure.
Okay.
Given I am the only one, I guess I can ask two different questions. I'm Carlos Calvo from Transport and Environment. First, a small comment. I was also surprised that 2040 was not that present in the report, because indeed, I mean, we can revise all we want, but if we're going towards 90% in 2040, we need to do way, way more than Fit for 55. That said, I was also a bit surprised about technology neutrality mentioned in the report and some of the statements in the panel. Because I mean, if we are to decarbonize, we can be technology neutral, but we cannot be technology blind. I mean, there are some technologies that are inherently better than others, more efficient, less resource intensive, and we need to bet on them. Ignoring that reality is basically just making us waste time. And then I would like to ask the question about the connection between technology neutrality and competitiveness, because actually technology neutrality can damage competitiveness because we go for too many options and then we actually don't focus on anything, and that's a problem.
Thank
Then
you. Oh, no,
maybe just a
is
very,
there another
very-
one? Or that's
very
number
short one,
3?
because finance was mentioned a lot in the panel. So I actually have a question for Yvonne, maybe a suggestion. I mean, you mentioned the 100 billions, but if we're looking for funding for sources for the decarbonization, I just have a small idea. For instance, Total made 20 billion only in 2023. So maybe an idea would be to tap into those windfall profits. Voila, maybe they could start contributing. The IEA estimated that only around 2% of the capital investments of the oil companies are going towards the transition. So I think there is a space to get further funding there.
Well,
Thank you.
let me say, we've been trying to tap into those windfall too, but we weren't that successful. Maybe you're more successful than us. But Antoine, there's Emanuele over there. Emanuele, you gotta raise your hand so Antoine can see you. There you go. So let's keep to that. And I think it's incumbent, I think at some point for some of us to also answer some questions, because I think there were questions / criticism, which is fair enough, but I think they also need to be answered. Emmanuel, let's
Thank
go
you.
to
I'll be very quick. So Emanuele Manigrassi, working for European Aluminium. One comment and one question. The first comment is on the report. I think this is one of the first reports that actually recognizes the need of complementary measures to the CBAM. As aluminum industry, we've always been very negative about it, and we very much welcome that you mentioned this. In the 2040 targets communication, this was initially stressed out, and then it was taken out. So good that you mentioned it. My question is, in your report, you mentioned that just because products are important for the energy transition, it doesn't mean they need to be produced domestically. So where do we draw the line? We have Net Zero Industry Act, we have Critical Raw Materials Act. Aluminium is on the CRM list, and it's a component. Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the Clement, maybe you want to address this last question, because I said it came up your alley, much more of an economist than I'll ever be.
Yes, thank you. Now, what should we produce ourselves and what should we import? I think the process of thinking hard about dependencies and geopolitical risks we have at the moment at European level, it's exactly the right process. The trouble is, if it ends up saying that everything is strategic, nothing is strategic. And that's why I think we need very clear criteria about what we think is critical. So I have a suggestion here. Goods are critical if when we imagine being cut off, we have a huge problem within, say, 2 months. That would be a geopolitical crisis, let's say, with China, okay, we are being cut off. So what is strategic from this perspective? I would say certain drugs. If we are cut off from antibiotics, people will be dying here in large numbers within 4 weeks. So we cannot completely depend on drugs produced in, I don't know, China or whatever. Assume we are cut off from solar panels. What happens within 2 months? Nothing. What happens within 4 months? Nothing. The only thing that happens is we cannot further expand our capacity. But the difference is that we have an installed capacity. And if we have a geopolitical conflict, the least thing we will think about is further expanding the capacities. That's why I say, we can import solar panels from China. I think we should do research in this area, yes, because it is the technology is important. We need to understand the technology. But it would be an error to subsidize domestic production of solar panels. If companies do this by themselves and are competitive, that's great. But I think it would be a severe error to spend resources on subsidizing solar panels or wind turbines. Let me add to that. This doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything about these investments. In Germany, maybe you've read about it. We've had this debate about subsidizing Siemens Energy. My understanding is, I've been very critical about that. But I think it does point to something which is important, and that's related to something Sabine said. What does it mean when we say the CO2 price is a priority? It doesn't mean we think we do the CO2 price and then we're gone. Let me give it, but what it does mean is we follow the logic of the CO2 price, which is let's cut emissions where they are cheapest. And I think that has two implications. I'll come back to Siemens Energy in a minute. So the first implication is we cannot have separate objectives either for sectors or for carbon capture, or because this is incompatible with cost minimization. Maybe there are other considerations. Political economy considerations. I can imagine things like that. And then I think that what we certainly have is, for instance, commitment problems. So we can say, oh yes, the CO2 price is great and we think it will increase in the future. But if investors think politically it will be impossible to have a high CO2 price in the future, they will not invest. So in that case, if the CO2 policy isn't credible, and I think it isn't, that's pretty clear, we will have difficulty finding capital for investments like wind turbines. And that's the issue with Siemens Energy. And I think then, yes, we need a complementary policy instrument. I think in that case, yes, it can be justified to give upfront subsidies or do similar things just to get this market going. But that's starting with the CO2 price, understanding its limitations and trying to complement it. This is not the same as saying, yes, there's a CO2 price, but then we will set separate objectives per sectors and do many other things that are totally incompatible with the CO2 price. So my understanding of the instruments is that they should complement the CO2 pricing in a meaningful way and preserve the cost minimization side. And I think that was what was meant in the report, and that was the way the people we talked to were discussing it. I think nobody thinks we can do the CO2 price as the only instrument, and then we're done. Thanks.
Let me add a few things here, even though I've got to ask Michael if he wants to, but I think I'll do it myself. The 2040 stuff. The 2040 stuff, it is not centerpiece on purpose. It is not centerpiece on purpose. Why? The world 2040 discussion is an important discussion, but it's not the only discussion. And what we're talking here about is about area that should be under observation and reflection. 2040 is something that we will do. But if this report becomes a discussion about 2040, then I think we failed. Because I have been in many meetings that similar to this, where actually the whole discussion became about 2040. And we think that this is a much broader discussion and a more, if you want, more principled discussion in many ways. The other thing is, Sabine, markets, when we say market, I think that market is a state of mind. And do you turn first to market solution or do you turn first to regulation? And, yes, we're not ideological at the RCST. If we have an ideology that we will turn first to market, we make no apologies for that. It's imperfect, we know that, but I think it's probably, in the long term, it's probably a better solution. And on sustainability, I make also no apologies for that. I have, since Rio de Janeiro in '92, sustainability has been the linchpin and the guiding light. And you cannot choose sustainability to use in certain ways and not in other ways. I think sustainability implies a harmonious move on the economic, social, and environmental axis. And this is what we're supporting. And we think this is compatible for the planet, but also for the transition. We have seen transitions in Central and Eastern Europe that have not been sustainable, have been a disaster, that have been not managed or not fully managed. And we are arguing, and in our case, it's a very long name, is the roundtable on this and that and sustainable transition, because we always thought that there has to be a transition. We never questioned the transition. All we supported was it's got to be well managed and sustainable. That's all we said. And if you have it in your name, I mean, how the heck am I going to dance around it? Yvonne, I think there was the gentleman for transport and environment, I think had a suggestion. No?
It was a suggestion.
Okay, then a suggestion. Then you make your point. So, Diana, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I would like to give some data regarding the question we had from the gentleman from TND, and thank you for the question and your remark regarding the investments of oil and gas in clean technologies. I guess you're referring to a number that is included in the report by the International Energy Agency, referring to the oil and gas globally. Well, here I represent European refiners, and I can tell you that on behalf of the European refiners who are leading the way in the energy transition, you will find among our members, companies, fuel producers and manufacturers who invest around 15 to 25% of their total investments in clean technologies. And this number is not mine. This number is included in this report by the International Energy Agency. So there is a big difference between the oil and gas sector globally and between the European refiners or the European fuel manufacturers, because our sector here in Europe is really leading the way, is paving the way in clean investments.
Gabrielle, very quickly, please, go ahead.
In the case of Total, because you suggested to tap into it, I can inform you that it's even over 25% of our investments. It's 33% of our investment that we do in renewables and in charging stations, in the rest. And you should, on the other part, rejoice that we invest this in Europe on revenues that are largely done outside of Europe. So we bring back to Europe huge investments in renewable. Just to have a look at the numbers.
Well, I tell you what, you will have the opportunity to maybe make your point again bilaterally, because the only road that we're paving is the road to drinks right now. So that's enough. I think we said 6:30, 7 o'clock. I suggest that the discussion around here has been what it was, and you heard it. But I think in the end, vorba volat scripta manet, and read the report. And, it's not too difficult to read 20 pages. I think it's interesting. You will disagree with some, you will agree with some. The point is, it's a debate. And for that, for being here, to you and the people on the Zoom, we thank you very much. But we do invite you for a drink. And again, I also like to thank those that are not at the table among the authors, because there are people within our teams that have been very active and instrumental in making this happen. And I'd like to thank them all, both in IFO and in ERCST. With this, I'll call it to a close. The report is available on the on the websites of IFO and ERCST. And as Yvonne has said, we have work ahead of us and we'll continue and hopefully you will join us in future debates. Thank you very much again. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
What we normally This is yes, I mean, so in Germany, the Germans love to